nailed Puerto Rico in a big way. And it really stressed the people, it stressed the agricultural system, the energy system. And so a lot of people have focused on the energy system, but I think there's been less focus on how it impacted farmers and communities. And so this, I think, we're going to learn a lot about sort of the resilience of communities, because if you don't have plants, you don't have sustenance, it's really tough. So I can't wait to hear your talk, and thank you for coming up.
All right, can you hear me well? I think we're supposed to use this one, but if we need to switch over, we'll just put this here as a plan B. Okay, it's great to be here. It's great to have a room full of young students and faculty, and so we're excited to be sharing what we did over the summer. My name is Nayla, and this is my colleague Alyssa. And we saw that while this is presented online, people are really just going to be looking at the slides. So we just want to do a brief intro, but put something prettier to look at. So I'm the one on the back. I grew up in Puerto Rico. I have a background in engineering, and I am really the first person in my family, at least in the last 2 or 3 generations, to really thinking about agriculture in a way of economic progress and a way of bringing forward what really defines Puerto Rico, and I'm really excited to be part of that community today.
And definitely this project is very close to our hearts. I grew up here in Boston, but I have family in Puerto Rico on my dad's side. My grandmother lives there, and my grandparents and my great-grandparents and way back were all farmers. So it was really wonderful to see the land and hear the stories of the farmers. So we're excited to show you that perspective.
Okay, so we'll be doing very little back and forth, but we wanted to make sure we introduced ourselves. This picture is also really interesting because in the front, there's one of the amazing farmers that we got to interview through this process, and what you're looking at is his farm, which probably doesn't look like a typical farm that you think about when you think about kind of like feeding people with farming activities. But it really defines how the agroecological movement in Puerto Rico is taking advantage of lands that would have otherwise been neglected by the traditional agricultural practices, or may just not be thought of as land that can be used for that purpose, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the person who's not present in the picture, but who took the picture, is María Nieves, and we'll talk more about her work later. But we just want to give a shout out to her because through the funding that we got through the Thai Fellowship, we were able to bring her in as a key informant, and she was really the one who helped us reach out to farmers that, because Alyssa and I had been living in the States, didn't really have a direct contact with, and so just want to highlight the role of community members and people that are engaged in doing change as collaborators in research and their role in kind of like really bringing forward the reality in our communities. So I'll just give a brief overview of agriculture in Puerto Rico because how many people have been to the island? Okay, great. That's a bigger number than I was expecting. And in the news, we see, 80% of the agriculture in Puerto Rico has been decimated because of the hurricane, but we may not necessarily know what that means in the context of food security, for example. So Puerto Rico became a colony of the U.S. in 1898, and that really marked a transition from a country that was predominantly agricultural in the sense of producing crops for export, and those crops were usually coffee, tobacco, and sugarcane. After we became a colony, around 1900, the Foraker Act was enacted to then make trade between the island and the mainland very easy. And because of that transition, coffee production, which had predominated in production, transitioned back to sugar and tobacco, and marked kind of like how the island's industrial process developed. As you know, the 1930s were a time of economic decline, and as a way to get out of that, we started thinking about industrialization in a different way. In Puerto Rico, that looked like educating peasants or bringing them into the city so that they could be, they could progress. And so in 1940, the Operation Bootstrap was enacted or put in place to then transition our economy from one that was largely rural and peasant-driven to one that was industrial. And so it really marked the decline of agriculture as a way of fueling the economy, and it marked the decline that we have seen ever since. So clearly this timeline is not drawn to scale, but fast forward to 2012, which is the last or the most recent agricultural census that we have to explore right now. And what we see here is that in terms of size, farms that are larger, so to the right in Cuerdas, are really the minority in the island and have been at least since 2007. And farms that are smaller or less than 10 cuerdas tend to be in the majority, but over time, even those have declined. And when you look at it in terms of value, which is what the USDA uses today to define the size of a farm, we see something very similar. So it is smaller farms, that's also what we see in the US, in the mainland throughout, are really the ones that are in the majority, but then again, you see a decline in sales starting in 2007 and onward. One would hope that if sales are going down in that category, they would be going up in other categories, and you kind of see that in the rightmost corner with the 60,000 over here, but not dramatically. And so what is not shown here is that there are other farming activities happening in the island, and those were reported in 2016 in the media. There's an article from The Salt, the NPR communication, and other media that were reporting this agricultural renaissance in Puerto Rico. But the numbers don't necessarily show that, and that's because the farmers that are driving that process, or were driving it prior to María and Irma, were farmers that didn't really belong to the group that would show up in a census. And so that is really the group that we're going to be talking about today. It is the agroecological movement in Puerto Rico. And so it's really, it is important to mention that we use the word movement because agroecology, as probably all of you know, is usually referred to as a practice of agriculture, which is very low in inputs and any foreign input into the land. You use crop diversity and self-made concoctions to make sure that you have a fertilizer and a pesticide available to you in case you need it. However, in Puerto Rico, it goes beyond that. It is really a movement of social equity and sovereignty, or food sovereignty, and this is not unique to the island. It is really what you see throughout South and Central America when agroecological movements arise, and you see that publicly. So Puerto Rico is part of that, and this really started in the 1970s, where this neo-peasant or neo-jibaro movement started to be more prevalent, similar to what was happening in the US, but in Puerto Rico it was really a way of also identifying with political ideals. And so this plays a role into why we don't see this group represented in the census, and we'll also talk about a little bit more. And also we wanted to highlight that Professor Nelson Alvarez Febles is a great resource if you want to learn more about the agroecological movement in Puerto Rico and to an extent throughout Latin America. So we prepared this poster for our presentation of our work in the fall. And what it is a map of land by type in Puerto Rico. And it highlights with red, the markets where we visited, and in black, the farms that we visited. You'll see that the markets that we visited in the island are spread throughout the periphery of the island. And the farmers that we visited, if you had the ability to look closer, you would see that they are located into what would be considered either barren or just not suitable for agriculture. And again, that highlights the fact that as we were looking into what was happening in Puerto Rico with farmers, we really decided to look at this other movement that hadn't been represented in the numbers, that we wondered, are they covered by any political support system? How are they going to get back on their feet if these are kind of like the individuals who may not become or be part of a larger system? So when we talk about resilience and recovery among farmers in Puerto Rico, and specifically as they return to mercados agrícolas, we wanted to highlight that we're talking about this group of farmers that are going to be addressing farming in a very different way, and that the markets that we're talking about may look different from the markets that you may have in mind. So in the US, perhaps when you're thinking about getting fresh local produce, you think of a farmer's market, or you think of some co-op that has had a formal structure put up and you can go to recurrently regardless of the season, etc. In Puerto Rico, historically, that place used to be La Plaza del Mercado. These were wet markets, are called in English and in other countries, and these are usually in large cities. So Puerto Rico, which is a very small island, 100 by 35, had several Plaza del Mercados throughout the island, but mostly in the urban casks. And there were physical structures, beautiful, typically located, surrounded by other forms of economic activity. And inside, you would see something maybe similar to this, maybe not, because this picture was taken very recently, and it actually alludes to what used to be found in the Plaza del Mercado. It has the jíbaro as more so a form of art, and you see some, these guys were probably playing dominoes before they were sitting down there and taking a break. But today you also see the Dole logo showing up in things, and so it marks this transition from being the place where jíbaros or peasants would go to bring what they cultivated from their farms to a place where now we see stuff that has been imported and brought in from either the Dominican Republic or a different country and is sold and is honestly not as visited as they used to be. In the 1950s, we started getting supermarkets in, and that took over kind of like the way that people went to get their produce. However, that transition, and here we see that it's typically families owning different stands, and there they put the stuff that they have available for sale. Today, markets are being taken back. This looks more similar to a farmer's market that you may see here in the States, but what's different here is that you have education happening recurrently, and these are farmer markets or mercados agrícolas, in the case of our research, that are really organized and put together by the agroecological community. And in the case of the one here on the right, is the one in Atorrey, it's La Placita Roosevelt, which we'll talk more about. But here, for farmers to participate, they have to be assessed by the community to make sure that they're using agroecological practices. Notice that we're not saying organic, which is more of a marketing term, as you probably know, but really, are they following the principles to which agroecology stands for? And so, if so, they're welcome to the market here, and they engage with the community just as you would see in other settings. Okay, so I'll pass it over to Alyssa to talk about actually what we did over there.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of our methodology and what we actually did while we were there. And so overall, we had 3 main research objectives, and we really wanted to look at the programs and policies that impacted these farmers after the hurricane. So how did those policies and programs build resilience among farmers in Puerto Rico, respond after a climatological disaster, and also enable them to reach markets? And so, as Nayla had said before, we got a lot of help in terms of participant enrollment, specifically from María. So she actually works with the Cooperativa Orgánica Madre Tierra and Cooperative Mother Earth. And she has many, many years of working in the agroecological movement in Puerto Rico. She knows many of the farmers, and so having her there was extremely important in terms of creating that rapport with the farmers and making them feel more comfortable in terms of telling their stories and learning more about what the impact of Hurricane Maria was on them. And so we used a recruitment letter so that we could gain consent to do these interviews and also the observations at their farms as well. So for data collection, we were doing straight data collection for about 3 weeks. For the observations, we did participant and non-participant. Over here in this corner, you can see us. We participated in what they call a brigada, which I'll go into a little bit more later, or a brigade you would call. And you can see us all working there, preparing the fields for yucca. And we did a lot of in-depth interviews using an interview guide and also audio recorded so that we could kind of get an idea more word to word about and make sure that everything that was said in interviews was accurate. And also for the observations, we took a lot of field notes as well, so that added to our interviews. So overall, for the research, we interviewed 32 farmers, agroecological farmers. So we were focusing on a very specific sample size and types of farmers. And we interviewed 5 leaders in organizations that were very key in terms of supporting these farmers after the hurricane. We visited 7 agroecological farms, which you can see all these pictures of all the places that we visited, and attended 5 agroecological farmers markets and attended 1 brigade, as I said. And as Nayla said before, you can kind of see all the farms are pretty spread out throughout the island, but there's only 5 markets, and they're kind of at opposite sides of the island. So for the data analysis, we reviewed all of our audio recordings and created kind of a code book to evaluate what were the common themes that we heard throughout all of our interviews. And it was a very iterative process. We had a lot of discussions with professors and also our key informants, and all of the interviews that we had, learning about more of the gaps and what their experiences were and what this movement means to them. And so for our findings, in terms of the actual people that we interviewed, we saw a pretty wide range of age groups. As you know, the population of farmers is aging out. Many people are retiring. But we actually saw some of the farmers there who had retired and kind of took this up as kind of their, I guess, term of like employment after retirement, and we're really passionate about it. But also we're seeing like the surgence of young farmers throughout the island who are really inspired by this movement, who have masters and very educated and are really inspired and want to continue the history of agriculture within Puerto Rico. So overall, when trying to understand the also for families, most of the time we saw it a farming couple, but interestingly enough, we saw that the leaders of the organizations were mostly female, so they're really taking the lead on the movement as well. Overall, we saw that in response to the hurricane and support, there was a general lack of government support. And so we were trying to figure out how were these farmers able to get back into the markets and how were they able to become so resilient. And most of the time, the reason why they didn't get government support was because of they either were not registered, and the process, they told us, was tons of paperwork, very arduous. And as you know, farmers' life, they don't have much time, especially small farmers. They don't have a lot of help. It's usually like, as I said, a couple, or they had a couple people who would help them out once in a while. Or they just didn't qualify for government funding, or the funding that they were getting was in terms of fertilizers or machinery that just didn't apply to the practices that they were using. And also, one of the reasons why some of the funding cannot go to them is because the government really doesn't know how many of these agroecological farmers there are on the island. So they can't really adequately supply a certain amount of funding if they don't know who needs it, what are their needs, and how many farmers are on the island. One of the key findings that we found was that compared to the conventional farmers, these farmers were able to get back to the markets much quicker. Actually, most of them said within a month after the hurricane, which was extremely surprising to us, especially from what we've heard on the island in terms of the media. And so seeing what factors applied to that resilience was very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So from our interviews and our observations, we found 4 main themes of resilience of the farmers. So number 1 was the agroecological farming practices. So that included a really big focus on soil health, and many of them attributed their recovery to the fact that they could plant seeds and their crops would just grow really quickly. They also had high turnover crops, so like lettuces and different things that they could sell really quickly, rather than like the fruit trees and things that take years to mature and years to actually produce enough to sell. And also there was a big emphasis on, like Nayla said, low external inputs. So they were creating their own compost. They were creating, using manure and things like that, where they didn't have to rely on fertilizers or chemicals. So, and also machinery as well. A lot of them use animals to till the soil and everything. So they didn't need to do that in order to start their growing process. So they were able to get back to markets. Number 2, it was the independent economic support. So in the next, actually I can show you now, these were many of the main organizations that provided funding right after the hurricane. A lot of actually all of the farmers that we spoke to had received funding from Visit Rico, this organization here, who had received, I don't know if many of you know Farm Aid, Willie Nelson. had given funding to Visit Rico and also Foundation for Puerto Rico. And it was actually within 4 weeks that they got the funding. And most of the farmers said that they used it for supplies or in order to like help with the cleanup because there was a lot of debris and things like that. And then also these other two organizations, which were kind of the midpoint between like the funding and the farmers. So they would help to provide that and identify specifically agroecological farmers who needed this funding. And they also created the brigades, which is where here with the third factor of resilience, inter-farmer organization post-hurricane, which I think was very unique within the agroecology movement. Doing the brigades, I think, was extremely imperative in terms of their recovery because they would basically bring these big groups of either volunteers or just community members or other farmers within the community, and each week they would go to a different farm and either help with cleanup or preparing the fields for another crop or even just emotional support. A lot of the farmers that we talked to were devastated after they lost everything. They didn't know what was going to come after, but they had hope, and all of them working together and communicating and, you know, teaching each other about different best practices really supported their recovery. And these organizations were definitely a big part of that. The fourth piece of resilience that we saw was the access to niche markets. So the Cooperative Mother Earth, they were the ones who kind of began the markets again after the hurricane, knowing that these farmers, you know, after the devastation, yes, they lost many of their crops, but many of them wanted to get back into business. They needed to sell their food, and they knew that people needed food because, as you know, there was a very difficult situation in terms of getting aid, especially to those who were living in the mountains and didn't have access to roads. So having that access to niche markets was extremely important. And as Nayla said, these markets are geared towards agroecological farmers. So they have to pass like this screening process basically to get into these markets. And many of them said that this was an area where they were able to educate their community because not everybody knows kind of what it means to be an agroecological farmer and what it means for people's health. And also they found it very important in terms of collaborating as farmers as well. So also within these organizations, there was also funding from many people from the mainland. We saw a lot of farmers, volunteers, and also other organizations that provided seeds, organic seeds for the farmers. So that was extremely important as well. At the end of each interview, we asked all of the farmers to express to us kind of what are the gaps in the system, how can they move forward and expand this movement throughout the island. And so many of them said these three main things, was that there was lack of government support and needed more funding for the farmers, greater access to markets to distribute their products, so either that be in like regular supermarkets or just creating more agroecological farmers markets, and also a stronger consciousness of these practices that they use so that people understand how important it is what they're doing, and also how they can spread the information. And so from this, Nayla will kind of talk about what we've seen and how these gaps can turn into solutions for the island.
All right. Actually, I just want to take a few steps back and go back to these organizations because they were, like Alyssa mentioned, really imperative in enabling farmers to get back to market. To say a little bit more about Visit Rico, for example, Visit Rico started much prior to the hurricane as an organization that really enabled tourists to experience Puerto Rico through agriculture. So they had a vested interest in the well-being of farmers. And when the hurricane happened, having been connected with the farming community and, of course, highlighting the agroecological farmers, farming facilities and their work, they were very in tune with their needs and kind of like their capacity, their location, and everything. When the hurricane happened, the diaspora, people like Alyssa and I, who are here in the mainland and were really concerned about how can we help, they were one of the main points of contact for kind of like, what are we going to do? And something came together called the Regrow Puerto Rico Fund, and it started here in the States. I honestly forget the details, but through that fund, a lot of money was donated by people like us and people like you who said, I want to do something to go directly to agriculture. And I think it was $500,000 that was accrued, and that money was specifically, so Organización Boricua, Madre Tierra, and other key stakeholders in the island got together quickly after the event and said, what are we going to do with that money? And they realized that what was needed was to really secure their livelihoods. Contrary to, and this is what we learned through interviewing these farmers, what the U.S. programming does is that you're insured and you're set up and we're going to have you backed as long as you fix your farm. So you have a flood, an event, the farmer has to have capital to fix the farm, and then they get reimbursed for that. Here, our small holder farmers didn't really count with that, and so this is really what marked the difference in their recovery, was that this informal network kind of like activated immediately and was able to say, don't worry, you have shown that you do what you do. We're just going to give you, it was about $2,500 twice throughout a year to have you get back up on your feet. And that was really what kind of like differentiated that. And then down here we have La Agroecological Solidaria, which was a movement that emerged from that need, and they were bringing volunteers, artists, and other experts to make sure that the well-being of farmers was secured beyond the physical well-being, but also emotionally. So the collaboration between these organizations and many others that we may just not be aware of was truly special, and that's really what we want to highlight through this work. Which brings me to this, which is essentially some suggestions or things that we could consider as an island in terms of bringing the farming movement and specifically the agroecological movement to a point where we can say there is an alternative food system in the island. And that would be because there is such little trust among farmers, is there a way that we can have an informal census, for example? If we interviewed 32 farmers, we don't know how many agroecological farmers there are, and I'm unsure that there's one single person in the island that can say exactly how many there are. But what can be done to unite that movement in a way that can enable them to the second point, organize themselves in a way that they can take advantage of something like Law 238 in the island, which would enable them to have access to federal funds that they would themselves manage. And then lastly, as Alyssa mentioned, connecting these farmers with processing streams. As you know, foods are perishable. There's a huge issue of food waste in many areas of our country and beyond. So processing brings an opportunity to increase shelf life of products. What can be done in the island to develop streams so that these farmers can have access to processing facilities and have a way to market their products and make them accessible. So we kind of wanted to close with this comparison because the story that we saw was that we were freaked out by what the media was showing us about farming in Puerto Rico and the decline of, 80% of agriculture is lost, and that happened, and that affected many lives, and as was mentioned, people were personally affected. And here we have a plantain field which has been lost, and a farmer who is devastated by that, and we saw that. But we also saw a movement like one of the farmers we interviewed here who had lost a ranch where they were doing most of their greenhouse stuff, but was so excited to share with us all the plans she had for her farm after that, and so all the new opportunities she saw after that. And so we just really want to highlight that, yes, this happened, but because I'm a Puerto Rican, I just have to say that the spirit is about progress, and it's about getting back up on our feet, and really, even as political commentary may say, like poor Puerto Ricans or the island are looking for help or whatever, really what we're looking at is a way to grow in a smarter way and a way that can be better than we were at before. So with that, we need to say thank you to a bunch of people, starting with our family, who did everything that they could to support us as we were traveling through the island in roads that were pretty bumpy and that. Our advisors who are not here today, but were encouraging in every step of the way. and the agroecological movement, because they really affected us personally in a positive way. And of course, Ty and the team, we really want to encourage you to apply again if you have a project that you're really passionate about, but they definitely funded this opportunity. Without that, we couldn't have spent the months that we spent in the island doing this work. So with that, we thank you, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions?
Hello, thank you very, very much for that. Mi familia viene de México y tengo un poquito de compasión. So, one of the things, most recently, what you were saying about how you want to project an image of positivity and optimism, I totally, totally get that. But even as you were saying that, I was like, oh my God, we can't say that here because then you're not going to get any help from us. Because, you know, it can be spun, and people have been trying to spin it that way. And because, I mean, one of the main reasons I'm here, aside from really liking the series, is that what you guys are going through is terrible. And not getting help is worse. But the fact that, yeah, you just picked up and went with it, or that's what your families have seen and everything, like, yeah, well done, you. So, you know, thank you. It was more of an observation than a question, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you again for going over this. We talked over an hour about this here, but I still have questions. I really like this project. And you focus on the small the small farmers, but I couldn't help but wondering what happened to the conventional farmers that lost plantation that are more focused on trees. So I'm wondering about their recovery, and also do you perceive there was a change to move towards other types of crops after the hurricane?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up, because our focus was very specific, but we were really curious about that aspect of the story as well. And so if you look at the census, plantains, papaya, pineapples, mangoes are among the top crops that we produce in the island as far as like agricultural produce. And those, as you may think, are very, a papaya tree, if it falls, it'll take some time for it to get back up on feet. Plantains, pineapples are very delicate and very seasonal. And so we had the opportunity to talk to a pineapple farmer who, he was the one to give us a perspective from a conventional farmer standpoint about he didn't really count with the income to fix his farm, and he was actually considering going towards an agroecological approach in his farm, perhaps not because of the social aspects of agroecology, but more so because it was more financially viable for him. So I can say, and this is a generalization, that farmers, agriculture in Puerto Rico is seen as an economic stream, and it is a very small one today, and there is interest in developing it, but it is very much following the approach that is you have funding to buy a large farm, you develop your own operations, and you get insurance. And so the response in that sector was pretty much what you would expect in standard terms, in terms of it being delayed, and people were just, a year after when we were there, we're starting to get some checks, and we're still kind of like struggling to get back up on their feet. So I don't have a concrete answer to tell you exactly what has happened, but the news have been showing some emergence in that, and so you hear news of seeds coming from Starbucks to help the coffee farmers get that going again. Again, coffee crops are very delicate, and they require, the soil was destroyed in terms of, moisture and all that, and so I guess what I'm saying is that their upbringing after the event was much slower. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. My name is Chris Cons. I teach courses in African history here this year at Tufts. My question kind of builds on the last one that was asked, and you talked about these agroecological farmers and then conventional farmers. I was wondering if you could talk more about what exactly, who are these people, how do their perspectives and views differ on ideas and concepts about resilience, progress, and maybe talk a little bit about what you know about when does this split happen? Is this Operation Bootstrap? Is this a kind of key moment where you start to see these different understandings of what progress might mean and what food sovereignty might mean, because it seems to me that to understand the way these different groups relate to one another or haven't related to one another in the past and present gives us a bit of a better idea about the kind of possibilities and pitfalls for this type of agricultural and social movement, as you put it.
Do you want to talk about her?
So yeah, I think there's definitely some point in time, and it was around like the 70s that the agroecological movement really took force within Puerto Rico, and I think you also see it in line with, I don't know if you all know about the organization La Villa Campesina, which is a peasant farmer-to-farmer movement throughout Latin America, and so that kind of entered into Puerto Rico and also began kind of that interest. And also, I think you can't really dismiss the fact that these practices are very, historical. They were always present on the island, but I think it was just that movement that was kind of highlighting it. And even like conventional farmers, they know to use cover crops and other things like that. But I think with the industrialization of agriculture on the island, they felt like they needed to only produce one type of crop. So you saw kind of that movement away from diversified crops. And but then there were still a group of farmers who kind of kept up those practices. So that's kind of one, I think, big difference between conventional and the agroecological farmers. But also with the agroecological farmers, we're also seeing innovation of different types of practices and a more focus on like soil health, and also within like the educational sphere, this kind of camaraderie between farmers and transfer of information. And I think with conventional farmers, it might be like more separate or a larger conglomerate that is kind of controlling like what they're doing exactly. I'm trying to think of the second part of the question.
I can add a few things. We had the opportunity to meet with one of the funders of, I shouldn't say funders because it's not like it's an institution, but one of the people who was really proud to share that he was very initial in the development of what is known as the agroecological movement. And it started in the mountains, and it started as a very political response to years of colonization and years, similar to what was happening in the mainland of like, can we think about other aspects of human well-being that are not related to capitalism? And so it started off of that. Today, there's a distinction between conventional farmers who the most profitable are ranchers, and the milk industry is very well organized in the island, and that is one of the few things which we import. But it was around 2009 with the thesis of who was soon after the Secretary of Agriculture in the island that in her doctoral work, Mina Comas, really started using the term of food import dependence and food security on the island. And I have to say that it wasn't until that point that those numbers, that 85% import really kind of like made it to the news. And I think that really brought forward this concept of, so food security is more than, the definition that we talk about in communities when there's food access and all of that, but really like we're an island and we're exposed to climate change. And she lined out exactly what most of our food comes in chips. And these have been the accidents over the last 10 years that have caused food not to make it to port. This is how many days of food we have in the island. So what are we going to do? We need a food sovereignty plan. We need to really think about these things. And so she started her role as a secretary in 2012. And it's interesting because 4 years later, the government changed, and so she was no longer the Secretary of Agriculture. But it was around that time that you started seeing a lot of press around like farmers markets, which we talked about, the agroecological farmers markets. She got some grants from USDA to start doing that with conventional farmers. So we didn't talk about that here, but the concept of a farmers market wasn't really present in Puerto Rico in the same way that it has been in the States for many, many years. And she organized that formally and established a way for conventional farmers to join that type of market. Which was very exclusive to conventional farmers. You had to have certain size farm and certain number of crops, in which way smallholder farmers were excluded from that. Maybe that precipitated the creation of these other markets. But I hope that answers the question a little bit about the distinction and kind of like that came about. As far as who they are independently, conventional farmers are very much doing this as an economic income sort of approach. We have a long history of El Jíbaro, and it's seen in two ways. There's this folkloric rural love for who we are as Puerto Ricanos, and then there's also this very negative connotation of like, if you're going to be called someone who's uneducated, you may be called a Jíbaro as well. And so I think that the decline might be related to wanting to progress and so step away from the land, and I'm using quotations if you're not looking at me online. But there's also this, so many people love it because they're tied to it personally and historically, and there's also the fact that it may be profitable for them. And then the agroecological movement is having this other perspective, which we've talked about.
And just one thing too, a lot of the farmers that we met, their farming operations are their main source of income. So it's becoming kind of that economic purpose as well for them as well, not just like conventional farmers, but you definitely see kind of that divide between the two.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was really, really interesting. I was curious, I guess you alluded to this in your last response about how the hurricane really exacerbated longstanding issues of food insecurity, right, on the island. And I was curious, when you mentioned that one of the gaps that remains is sort of gaining more awareness or recognition of these agroecological systems and movement and markets. Do you have a sense of some of the obstacles for the farmers? Like, who's going to these markets? Is it just other agroecological farmers buying products from other people? Or is it really like spreading into the broader community of Puerto Ricans and sort of shifting their focus into more local agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, definitely going to the markets, you saw a lot of it's definitely a tourist attraction as well. But for the local community especially, a lot of people will go there weekly to learn about the different, vegetables or fruits that's coming out, and they're doing a lot of education in terms of, maybe they don't know how to use this vegetable or fruit and how do you cook it, and different kind of education systems like that. But also in terms of the gaps, I think it's starting to become more common that people are aware of it, but making it more of, I guess, nutrition education, they said, was a big point of gap within the schools and the younger population. So that, I think, would also be very important in terms of gaining awareness of the practices and the types of foods that they're selling. But also, yeah, I think there's definitely a movement and more knowledge, but it's not as commonplace amongst all the whole population.
I think the differences are very geographic. So Alyssa mentioned the tourist attraction. So in Rincon and Aguadilla, we saw that the farmers markets or the mercados agrícolas were visited mostly by tourists who were visiting the west coast and the beaches and all that, in Old San Juan as well. But definitely Ponce and Atorrey or San Juan were visited by people who were looking for foods that would make them better or make them healthier overall. So there was, when they found out that we were part of the Friedman School, which has nutrition in the title, they're really excited to hear, how can nutrition be part of this conversation? And so we too were pushing with our questions about, is there an association with the School of Nutritionists in the island about, not about maybe organic produce only, but just sourcing, using local produce, and just also just increasing the amount of fruits and vegetables that we consume overall.
Hi, thank you for presenting your research. It was really interesting. My question is about the agroecological movement. You talked about how it's been around for a long time and how it worked into your research, but in recent years it's become bigger in Puerto Rico. Why do you think there's a push for it right now, the agroecological movement?
I think it has to do with, as Alyssa mentioned, a lot of the people that participate in that movement today are either individuals who have had careers and are now retiring and are choosing to do something that it's also a stance of, we met farmers who had retired and had said, I just want to not depend on anyone. I see what we have gone through. I just saw what happened in the hurricane. Some people turning to farming after the hurricane. We met at least 2 individuals. One of them was a woman who had retired recently and said, this is what I'm going to do now. The other one was a young guy who had been working as the driver, follow me here, he was the driver of a local seed company, one of the few. So there's a seed company in Puerto Rico. They had this driver, they had to let him go because of the hurricane and kind of like decline in income, and he had been trained through his job, and he decided to then take on farming. So so who are these individuals and why is this growing? I think it's a combination of the political situation in the island and the economic situation, and this feeling of, for many years we have been a colony, for many years the situation has been declining. What can we do to remain in this land that we love and that we want to make better? And so these are people who have been educated in different ways, whether professionally by experience or people with master's degrees, and who have gone in and studied how can they use the soil more productively, and are saying, now I'm going to make it happen. La Guagua Solidaria is an example of that, and many other things.
So we talked a little bit at the beginning, before you started, about Casa Pueblo. So it strikes me, the conversations that I hear are, we import a ton of our food, we import even more of our energy. Here we are, a tropical island, potentially full of solar potential, wind potential, but we're completely dependent on fossil fuels as an economy. Is the growth of, I guess my question is the growth in the agroecological movement tied closely to the growth of sort of the renewable energy, the idea of sort of self-sufficiency in general, so that it goes beyond sort of whether you're a farmer, you could also just be a banker in a small town and saying, we need to be able to function after hurricanes, so let's make so how much is it outside of agriculture that's pushing sort of more attention to the agroecological movement?
I think that's a very good observation and point, and I would generally say, yeah, I bet. It's not something that I can quantify, but it's definitely at the markets, going back to the question of who goes to these markets, you see people who definitely stand by the movement. So agroecology as a movement of social support and equity and sovereignty. And so that stems definitely into our energy situation, which everybody felt. I was there on Three Kings Day, so that had been like 2-3 months after the event, and we didn't have electricity in my mom's house. So it's dignifying or indignifying to be in a situation where you see how easy it could be to restore power, but you're just sitting there wondering, how can I make sure that this doesn't happen again? Because there's going to be a bigger and worse hurricane. I'm sure there's someone in the audience who can actually answer that question better. So.
Sure. I don't know if I can answer it, but I sure I'm in alignment with you there. My name is Yanel D'Angel. I am an architect. I am a Puerto Rican. I practice in Boston, and after the hurricane, I had what I call the Star Wars awakening, and I led the creation of a platform called Resilient C for social, economic, and environmental. And this goes right to your point about seeing things in silos has been a chronic problem. And after living through Hurricane Maria, people are realizing that things are very interconnected. And if they are not, they sure should be to be resilient. So you talk about food is energy, and we don't talk about agriculture as energy, but it is. Think about composting and what that can do. So diversity of crops, I will say diversity of energy sources, diversity of so many things are what make us resilient. But we also need policy to change the ways we have been doing it and start interconnecting the synergies between what has traditionally been silos. One thing that I really enjoyed about your presentation, so through this work, and Mika can tell you more, she's part of this multidisciplinary platform, is that there is an outcome of the hurricane has been more awareness about food. So you have famous Spanish chef going down 3 days after the hurricane and cooking in great scales. So now, say, one of the markets in Santurce became kind of a hub where very high-end chefs are taking the products from the island and making amazing, dishes. So it has become a tourist destination for that. If you saw the Jimmy Fallon show the other day, you can get a picture of that.
So I think, it's all interconnected, and the more we think about these different aspects as all connected is important. And final point, we are involved in the creation of a resilient housing guide for communities, and it's going to be free of charge. It's a very large effort led by enterprise community partners. And one of the chapters is all about farming and how, and I want to connect you with them, but farming. And in what we are hearing from community leaders is, yeah, that's great. We need to have our backup plan as a community, and yet also as individuals. So there is a lot to be done in this area, definitely.
Thank you for sharing all of that.
Thank you.
So we need to stop now, but I want to just thank you again for coming. Can we give them a big round of applause?
Thank you.
So as is our tradition, we are really hoping you will help us with the chairs. It's a little tight this week because of the books and things.